I'm John McNeil, a mechanical engineer by day and saxophonist by night. You may know the names Godley and Creme as directors of some of the most well-known music videos from the early 80s, or from their single and video for Cry in 1985. Or you may also know the band 10cc, of which they were members with Eric Stewart and Graham Gouldman from 1972 to 1976. When I was young, I remember being both haunted and intrigued by I'm Not in Love on the radio. Then had the same reaction to Cry almost 10 years later, but didn't make the connections with 10cc until about 20 years ago. Later, I learned of Consequences, but the audio was hard to come by back then, and it remained this mysterious thing, but I was obsessed with finding it. I eventually found it on vinyl, listened to it in full, was a bit confused as to what I had just heard, but recognized that I had not ever heard anything like it, and knew I wanted to hear more. This triple disc album is part gizmo demonstration, part pop song collection, part radio play, and part electric orchestral suite.
This week's request comes from John McNeil from Acton, Mass., also known as Noisy Noise on the Progressive Ears Forum. John is a musician who plays sax for Polarized Guru. And John suggested Consequences by Lowell Creme and Kevin Godley. One of the more interesting things that I've learned over the past year or two is how important and how well loved both 10cc and Godley and Creme are, especially among those that have an interest in progressive music. I mean, I obviously knew I'm Not in Love and The Things We Do for Love. There was no escaping those back in the day. And I remember when Godley and Creme had a decent-sized radio hit with Cry, partly because of the sort of weird face morphing video they made, but mostly because it was featured in one of the more memorable music segments on Beavis and Butthead.
Now it's over.
But it wasn't until I saw a documentary about the making of I'm Not in Love that I saw how creative these guys are. And honestly, I think it was seeing that documentary that informed me that Kevin Godley and Lowell Creme were in 10cc. I don't think I knew that before then. And I'm sure most of you watching this already know the story of the making of I'm Not in Love. But basically, for those of you that don't know, they use long tape loops with their voices on it, and doing that, they were able to turn the mixing desk into an instrument, right? And that's how the backing tracks were created. Check it out if you haven't already.
And we spent 3 weeks recording 3 of them in the studio, Kevin, Lowell, and Graham, singing "Ah."
But having zero experience with their music outside of those 3 examples, I honestly have no clue what I'm in for with Consequences. I will say, though, I've shared my full Season 4 list of albums with a handful of my friends, people whose opinions about music I respect, and many of them responded to the inclusion of Consequences with something like, Consequences? Ooh. So potentially I'm in for something pretty cool. And according to the credits, we've got vocal work from Peter Cook and his wife, Judy Huxtable. Wild. The one thing that has me a bit nervous, just in terms of the time available to me, is the fact that it's a 6-sided album. We're talking a Joe's Garage length album here. So John has some more to say, but meanwhile, it's time for me to face Consequences.
10cc was a band with 2 camps. Eric and Graham possessed much of the pop sensibility of the group, while Kevin and Lowell were of a more experimental nature. This friction led to some fascinating art rock, the most famous single being I'm Not in Love in 1975. While in 10cc, Godley and Creme invented the Gizmotron, or gizmo, a device attached to a guitar with motorized rubber wheels, which would create a bowing effect, allowing them to realize orchestral sounds and other effects from the guitar. They felt their ideas with the gizmo were outgrowing what they could do within 10cc. Godley and Creme left the group in 1976 to double, nay, triple down on their experimentalism to work on Consequences.
Okay, that's a lot. I suppose right at the beginning I should say that a good portion of Consequences is not actually music. For For much of sides 3 through 5, there's an ongoing kind of Goon Squad / Monty Python / not only ... but also type British comedy skit about a couple consulting with their attorneys about a divorce while they are occasionally interrupted by the pianist who lives downstairs. Oh, and the pianist also has the power to control the weather. Some of it's funny enough, especially if you're already a fan of Peter Cook, but some of it feels pretty uncomfortable by today's standards, with some of the humor relying on cultural stereotypes, if not general unpleasantness. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these aspects of the narrative. I feel that these stretches probably need to be there to convey the full album experience, but I also feel like I probably have more to say about the music than the comedy, at least in this setting. And since there are 18 songs, 10 breaks for dialogue, which includes some incidental music, a full album side suite, and 17 movements, I don't think it's practical to go over every track on the album. So I'll try and explain as much as I can in broader strokes and focus on the interesting bits. Side 1 is entirely instrumental, and side 2 is mostly instrumental with one very notable exception. The songs on side 1 are largely atmospheric and feature some textures that I don't know that I've heard replicated anywhere else. Some of what I'm hearing is technology, right? Like using an envelope follower, specifically a Capex processor, which is a kind of a noise gate. They use that to set the master gain on the fire section of Stampede and the snoring bits of Sleeping Earth. An envelope follower is a special kind of circuit that turns an audio signal into a control voltage. The louder the signal is, the higher the voltage. Many engineers will use something called side channel compression or gating, where they feed something like a kick drum into a compressor and use the compression level to turn everything else down and leave the kick drum alone, so that it stands out more. An envelope follower is the circuit that makes side channel compression possible. But there was also something going on with the instrumentation. There are long sections where the primary instrument is something between a guitar, a string section, and a mellotron. Come to find out, it's something called a gizmotron. Basically, it's a set of like motorized wheels that act as a bow for the guitar strings. There are these 6 buttons, right? And each one engages the wheel that then spins to engage a string. It makes it sustain like a violin bow. Of the instrumental tracks early on the album, the standout for me is Stampede, which has a very catchy, satisfying, and almost Copeland-esque melody. Well, satisfying if you exclude the silly little Disco King section in the middle of it anyway. And side 2 begins with atmospherics, but there's a break in the middle for a bit of kitsch called Honolulu Lulu. And one bit of warning for those of you that might have a touch of misophonia, the last track on side 2, The Flood, is decidedly moist. Nice guitar work though. Side 3 starts with my favorite song on the album, 5 o'clock in the morning. Gorgeous song, great build throughout, lovely songwriting, good melody, clever turns of phrase, good song.
It's 5 o'clock in the morning, you're lying in your bed.
And from there we get into the comedy bits and the divorce of the Stapletons, periodically interrupted by some actual songs. But one of those songs, When Things Go Wrong, has Mel Collins on sax, and another, A Lost Weekend, has the fabulous Sarah Vaughan on vocals.
Only time will tell.
Not a whole lot of music on side 4, aside from some incidental a cappella music about horse racing, a bit of overly corny treacle called Rosie, and a decidedly slick bit of business to end the side called It's Cool, Cool, Cool in the Morning. Man, those ELO folks really started something, didn't they? Side 5 is kind of the climax and conclusion of the story arc, so the music takes a backseat for most of it. There's a ballad called Sailor, nice enough. There's some instrumental incidental music called Mobilization, which starts as a rearranging of the Vamp and Sleeping Earth. And while the music in Please, Please, Please is cool enough, The vocal performances are grating. And finally, side 6, Blint's tune, movements 1 to 17. Where the first 2 sides of the album concentrated on experimenting with recording techniques and with harnessing the gizmotron, this last stretch is more traditionally arranged and performed, with the primary focus being the piano, which does fit with the story. There are callbacks, there are interesting transient moments, but mostly it's chamber music for small band and piano. On the whole, Consequences is a lot to process. I think I like it, but yeah, it's a lot. So I'm going to go think on this and listen to it a bunch more. So, John, come on back down and say more words, and I'll be right back.
How was this album received at the time? Not very well. It was expensive and released at a time where experimental rock and pop were out of favor. Aside from a few bits that haven't aged well, current opinion seems to look a bit more favorably on Godley and Creme's duo debut. To quote Steven Wilson, Consequences is one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious, concept records of the 70s. In my opinion, I love it. It's a beautiful mess. I find that all the music is interesting and much of it is gorgeous and sophisticated. I hear some Zappa influence on the final suite even. There are parts of the play that still make me laugh every time I hear them, and just the studio work itself is astounding, considering when it was recorded. For more information, I would encourage you to check out the excellent website Mr. Blint's Attic by Giles Booth. And there's also even a podcast devoted to the album.
Yeah, you need to hear this album. If you haven't heard Consequences before, I think you should find the time to check it out. But do so knowing it's not something you can just leave running in the background. Give it the same kind of time and attention you would for some of the longer, more sprawling, more interesting albums like Joe's Garage by Zappa, the 2 Scambot albums by Mike Keneally, or Escalator Over the Hill by Carla Bley and Paul Haynes. And thank you, Maestro Bley. You were amazing. I'm so glad I got to see you live. Before I go any further, I do want to shout out Sean McCreevy and the Consequences podcast. His direct from the master video of Consequences was the one and only place online that I could hear the entire album. Yep, Consequences is not on any streaming service. Not on Bandcamp, not for sale in the Apple or the Amazon stores. You can't even get the CD any place except for used outlets and imports. And those are like $80. If not for Sean's amazing recording, I would have had to spend many an hour making digital recordings from my turntable. And just in general, Sean's video is a fabulous way to experience Consequences, since he includes the art from the booklet and all the track names as it goes. Thanks, Sean. But you know what got me going this week? It's the historical context of this album. That's what fascinated me the most. First, there was the invention of the gizmotron. And I mean, I totally get it. In a world where studio time, producers, and especially the hiring of an entire orchestra can get damn expensive, having something like a gizmotron that would allow you to get orchestral textures just by overdubbing a few guitars, that's quite appealing. And then there's the recording time. Consequences was supposed to be a single album recorded in 3 months, and it turned into a triple album that took more than a year to finish, with Kevin Godley and Lowell Creme having to come in at night so the studio could do other work during the day. But the thing is, they were by no means the only musicians having these struggles in 1977. In a time when punk was eating up everyone's attention, it was becoming harder and harder to justify long and expensive recording times to record companies when they could release 10 punk albums for the cost of your one progressive project. And so, the number of musicians that could continue to work in this style slowly dwindled to just those that had their own publishing, their own recording capabilities, and their own lucrative back catalogs. Your Frank Zappas and your Steely Dans. Since then, we've had 2 generations of musicians come up, with the Gen Z kids just now in a spot to start their projects. And now, any kid with a laptop, an audio interface, and a copy of Ableton Live has at their disposal orders of magnitude more recording technology than Godley and Creme could have possibly imagined in 1977. There is absolutely nothing stopping any aspiring young composer or performer from making things that would have been impossible 45 years ago, even with a gizmotron. But thanks to the culture shifting away from progressive music towards punk all those years ago, we've lost 40 years of innovation in the composing and recording aspects when it comes to studio recording. That thread was largely broken, and I'd argue that it's being taken up again. For sure. There's amazing music being made these days. But, and here's where my mind has kept going. What if something like Consequences had been a herald for new things instead of an ambitious but mostly ignored work? Where would we be now? Again, the mind boggleth. This is all a long way of saying that I like Consequences. It's big and squishy and silly and occasionally moist, but it's also innovative, satisfying, and always fascinating. Scale of 1 to 10, I give Consequences the count of 17.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
See you next week.